100-pound rescue, Cheetah refuses to leave Dad's lap. Her final goodbye will destroy you. Eliot Walker sat at the old wooden table inside the cabin, perched at the edge of the reserve in Chaco Canyon. The warm yellow light casting over his sun-worn, time-worn face. The kerosene lamp flickered beside him, its glass chimney blackened with soot from countless solitary evenings, throwing dancing shadows across walls that had witnessed too much silence, too much grief. Outside, the desert wind moved through the canyon like a mournful breath, carrying with it the scent of sage and dust and the endless expanse of a landscape that cared nothing for human sorrow. On the wall hung a framed photograph of his only daughter, once devoted to wildlife conservation, standing beside a wild cheetah, her eyes filled with hope and a burning desire to save the natural world. Her name had been Sarah, and in the photograph her hand rested lightly on the cheetah's shoulder, her smile radiant with the kind of pure conviction that had both awed and frightened him. She had taken that picture 3 years before her death, during a research expedition in Namibia, and she had sent it to him with a note that read simply, "Dad, this is why I do what I do. I hope someday you'll understand." He had put the note away in a drawer, too proud to admit that he didn't understand, too stubborn to ask her to explain, since the day she died in an accident during a field survey. The little house seemed to stop breathing. Every sound had faded into nothing but wind slipping through the windows and memories weighing heavily on Eliot's heart. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah had been conducting a routine population survey in the backcountry of Montana, tracking grizzly bear movements through a remote valley. The rock slide that killed her had been sudden and massive, triggered perhaps by the early freeze-thaw cycles that made the mountain slopes unstable. By the time the rescue team reached her, it was too late. Eliot had received the call while he was fishing at his favorite spot on the San Juan River. And the moment he heard the ranger's voice on the other end of the line, he had known. Some part of him had always been waiting for that call, had always feared that Sarah's passion for wildlife would lead her into danger she couldn't escape. And now that fear had been realized, leaving him alone in a cabin that felt like a tomb, surrounded by the echoes of arguments they would never resolve, words they would never take back. Every day he looked at that photograph and wondered, did he still matter in a world that had long since changed? Did his life have any purpose now that the one person who had challenged him, frustrated him, and loved him unconditionally was gone? The sweltering New Mexico desert summer was thick with dust and heat, a place modern eyes often deem barren and forgotten. The temperature had been hovering above 100 degrees for weeks, baking the red earth until it cracked like old pottery, sending up shimmering waves of heat that distorted the horizon into liquid mirages. The tourists who ventured into Chaco Canyon took their photographs quickly and retreated to their air-conditioned vehicles, unable to comprehend how anything could survive in such harshness. But Eliot had lived here long enough to know the desert's secrets, to understand that life persisted in the shadows and the crevices, in the cool darkness beneath rocks, in the patient waiting for the rare gift of rain. But that day, the dryness was broken by the harsh ring of a telephone. The sound startled him from his afternoon stupor, the drowsy half-sleep he often fell into during the hottest part of the day. His hearing aid squealed with feedback as he fumbled for the receiver, his arthritic fingers clumsy with age and disuse. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Martin Hayes, the head veterinarian at the Regional Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. Martin's voice was tight with urgency, the words tumbling out in a rush that suggested he had already made several calls and was running out of options. An illegal cheetah trafficking ring had just been uncovered, an old trap. The body of a mother cheetah wedged between rocks, and a faint cry, like a plea born from despair rising from somewhere nearby. The authorities had raided a property 30 miles east of the canyon, Martin explained, arresting 3 men who had been smuggling exotic cats across state lines for private collectors and illegal breeding operations. The operation had been going on for months, maybe years, and this mother cheetah had been one of their latest acquisitions. She had somehow escaped from their facility, but in her desperate flight through unfamiliar terrain, she had become trapped in a narrow crevice between 2 massive boulders. By the time the wildlife officers found her, she had been dead for at least 12 hours, her body wedged so tightly that they would need specialized equipment to extract her. The center had received the alert, and when no one else dared to climb the rocks in the fading light to search for any possible offspring. They called Eliot. At first he refused old age, an aching back, poor eyesight, unsteady feet. The excuses came automatically. A well-rehearsed litany he had perfected over the 3 years since Sarah's death. He was 72 years old, he reminded Martin, too old to be scrambling over boulders in the dark. His knees were shot from decades of hiking rough terrain during his years as a forest ranger. His eyesight had deteriorated to the point where he needed reading glasses for anything closer than arm's length and distance glasses for anything farther away. His hands trembled with essential tremor, making fine motor tasks increasingly difficult. Besides, he had left that world behind. The wildlife work, the rescues, the constant emotional investment in creatures that so often didn't survive despite everyone's best efforts. He had buried all of it along with his daughter. But when he glanced at his daughter's photograph, he knew he could no longer turn away. Sarah's eyes seemed to look directly at him from across the room, challenging him the way she always had, asking the question he had been avoiding for 3 long years. What had her death meant if he refused to honor what she had lived for? What had her passion, her dedication, her sacrifice been worth if he simply retreated into grief and bitterness? If not me, he murmured to himself, then who else? The words came out as barely a whisper, but they carried the weight of a vow, a promise made to a daughter who could no longer hear him, but whose presence filled every corner of this small cabin. Eliot gathered his old flashlight, tested the batteries twice to make sure they still held a charge, took a water bottle from the cabinet, and placed his worn hat on his head. The hat had been Sarah's last birthday gift to him, a proper ranger's Stetson made of felt the color of sand. With a braided leather band she had tooled herself with his initials. He hadn't worn it since her funeral, hadn't been able to bear the weight of that final gesture of love. But now he placed it on his bed and felt something shift inside his chest, as if Sarah herself were nodding in approval. Beside him, Buddy, the russet-coated rescue dog, with gentle eyes and a keen sensitivity to every whisper of nature, whined softly at his feet, as if he, too, understood the mission that night. Buddy had been Sarah's dog originally, a mixed-breed rescue she had adopted from a reservation shelter during her graduate school years. The dog had traveled with her on many of her field assignments, had learned to navigate wilderness with the sure-footed confidence of a wolf, had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense injured animals. After Sarah's death, Buddy had simply appeared at Eliot's door one day and refused to leave. And though Eliot had initially resented the animal's presence, another reminder of everything he had lost, the dog's quiet companionship had gradually become indispensable. The volunteer rescuers, a small, makeshift family of their own, followed behind in a rattling pickup truck. There was Maria, a young biology student from the university who volunteered at the center on weekends. Carlos, a retired paramedic who had moved to New Mexico for the climate and stayed for the work. And Jennifer, a photographer who documented the center's rescues and releases. They did not know what awaited them, only that someone out there needed help. And that Eliot Walker, despite his age and his grief, was the only person in the region who knew that particular section of canyon well enough to navigate it safely in darkness. The drive took 40 minutes, the headlights cutting through gathering dusk as they followed dirt roads that became progressively rougher, finally parking at the base of a rocky outcrop that rose like a jagged tooth against the darkening sky. When the flashlight sliced through the darkness, the rock crevice emerged under the faint moonlight, two boulders leaning together to form a narrow slit. And at the bottom, something was crying, softly, weakly. The sound was almost imperceptible, a faint mewling that could have been mistaken for wind or the call of a night bird. But Eliot's trained ear caught it immediately. Buddy suddenly froze, ears pricked forward, his body trembling with tension. Then he barked, hoarse and urgent, pointing the way with his nose. Eliot leaned down and peered into the bottom of the crevice, his flashlight beam probing the darkness. There, nearly 6 feet down in a space barely wide enough for his shoulders, was a tiny creature. Scruffy gray fur barely visible against the dark stone, ears still half-folded, a cheetah cub, its eyes still closed, its body shivering with fear and exhaustion. The tiny cry that escaped was not the fierce growl of a wild predator, but the fragile, mournful call of a baby searching for its mother. Eliot estimated the cub couldn't be more than a week old, perhaps 10 days at most, without immediate intervention, without warmth and milk and care. She would be dead by morning. Eliot fell still. A sharp pain rose inside him, memories of his daughter, of words unsaid, of the regret he carried for once opposing her work in conservation. He remembered their last real conversation, the one that had taken place in this very cabin 6 months before her death. Sarah had come to visit, hoping to share her excitement about a new research project, and instead they had argued. He had told her she was wasting her life, that conservation work was a fool's errand, that the world was too broken to be saved by one person's idealism. She had looked at him with such disappointment, such profound sadness, and had said quietly, "I thought you would understand, Dad. I thought you knew what it meant to care about something bigger than yourself. I thought that's what you taught me when I was growing up. Watching you work as a ranger, watching you care for the forest and the animals. What happened to you?" He had had no answer then, and he had no answer now, except that fear had happened to him, fear that her passion would get her killed, and the terrible knowledge that his fear had been prophetic. His trembling hands reached for the cub, a nameless little girl, and he whispered, "Sweet child, I'm here now. I won't let you die alone." The rescue took nearly an hour. Carlos rigged a simple harness system using climbing rope, and Eliot, despite his age, insisted on being the one to descend into the crevice. His body barely fit in the narrow space, and for a few terrifying moments, he thought he might become stuck. But then his hands closed around the tiny, warm body of the cub, and he lifted her carefully, supporting her head the way he had once supported Sarah's head when she was an infant. They lifted her out, wrapped her in a coat, every ragged breath threatening to shatter Eliot's heart. The cub weighed almost nothing, and her tiny body radiated a fever heat that spoke of dehydration and stress. Buddy quietly climbed into the back of the truck, sitting close to the bundle, as if standing guard over this fragile new life. All through the night, crossing the scorched desert beneath the headlights in the star-studded sky. The cub's cries faint, whimpering lingered in the air. Maria sat in the back with Eliot, monitoring the cub's breathing. While Carlos drove as quickly as the rough roads would allow, Eliot never once loosened his grip on the protective blanket. It was just like the way he held his daughter years ago when she drifted in and out of consciousness in the hospital. In those final hours when he had whispered apologies she probably couldn't hear, when he had made promises to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. And now, decades later, he found himself making another promise to another fragile life, hoping this time he would be able to keep it. When they arrived at the center, the head veterinarian, Dr. Martin Hayes, glanced at the exhaustion etched into Eliot's face and the anxious look in Buddy's eyes. Martin was in his early 50s, a competent and dedicated veterinarian who had devoted his career to wildlife rehabilitation. He had known Sarah, had worked with her on several projects, and he understood the weight of grief that Eliot carried. He bent down, poured special milk into a tiny bottle, and handed it to Eliot. "Save her, Walker. But remember, we don't raise pets. One day, you'll have to let go." The words were meant as a warning, a reminder of the fundamental principle that governed all their work at the center. Wild animals belonged in the wild, and human attachment, no matter how well-intentioned, could become a form of captivity. Eliot turned away from the photo of his daughter as if turning from an unfinished promise. He took the bottle, held the cub, whom he now named Luna, and began the long journey of raising her. The name came to him without conscious thought, inspired perhaps by the moonlight that had illuminated her rescue, or by the way her tiny cries had sounded like celestial music in the darkness, or simply by the feeling that this small creature represented a second chance, a new beginning emerging from the darkness of his grief. Despite his aging body, he changed her milk every 3 hours, rubbed her back to stimulate digestion, rocked her gently like a child, and hummed the simple lullabies his daughter used to sing before bedtime. The schedule was punishing for a man his age. Every 3 hours, day and night, the alarm would sound, and Eliot would drag himself from sleep to prepare formula, warm it to precisely the right temperature, and coax Luna to feed. Sometimes she latched onto the bottle immediately, sucking with desperate hunger, Other times she refused, turning her head away, and he would have to be patient, stroking her throat, encouraging her with soft sounds until she finally accepted the milk. Between feedings, there were other tasks: cleaning her enclosure, monitoring her temperature, checking for signs of illness or parasites, documenting her weight gain in a careful log that Martin reviewed during his regular visits. Buddy never left her side. Whenever Luna whimpered, the dog pressed close, lying near to protect her, his warm body providing comfort and security. Slowly, Luna learned to trust that Buddy, though a different species, was still a friend, still family. The soft licks, the tiny nudges of her nose into Buddy's fur, the rapid little tail flicks whenever he entered her enclosure, all of it was a wordless language of warmth and safety. Eliot watched their bond develop with something approaching wonder, seeing in it a purity of connection that human relationships so rarely achieved. Buddy seemed to understand instinctively what Luna needed, adjusting his behavior to accommodate her changing moods and developmental stages. Day by day, Luna grew, her eyes gradually open, revealing irises of startling amber that seemed to hold depths of ancient wildness. Her fur shifting from scruffy gray to golden streaked with black, her ears standing tall and alert, muscles forming beneath her skin like a young sprout rising into solid wood. Every time she lifted her front paws and licked Eliot's elbow with her rough little tongue, he looked at his daughter's photograph and held back tears, proud and aching at once, because he knew Luna was more than a life to be saved. She was a chance at redemption, a way to close the wound of the past, a bridge between the man he had been and the man his daughter had wanted him to become. Yet beneath that wild exterior, Luna was still gentle as a kitten, quiet, content to be held, seeking affection rather than wandering her enclosure, choosing to follow Buddy instead of exploring her surroundings with the bold curiosity typical of young cheetahs. Every time Eliot opened the door to her enclosure, she trembled and climbed into his arms, pressing her head against his chest as if listening to his heartbeat. Every little chirping sound childlike, as if calling for a mother who was no longer there, tightened something inside Eliot's chest. He began to worry that perhaps he was doing this wrong, that his need to nurture was somehow impairing her development, making her too dependent, too tame. Some nights, he sat silently under the moonlight, listening to the wind tear through the leaves of the cottonwood tree beside the cabin, Buddy breathing softly beside him, his graying muzzle resting on Eliot's knee. Luna slept curled around his ankles, heavy and warm, but her eyes cracked open now and then, checking to make sure he was still there, as if to say, "You are my home." Eliot gazed at the sky, cold stars above, indifferent and eternal, and at his feet a fragile soul reborn through compassion, through the undoing of his long-held guilt until tears came. Unsure whether they were born of joy or sorrow, these quiet moments became his meditation, his prayer, his way of talking to Sarah across the impossible distance of death. Dr. Hayes had once warned, "Walker, we don't raise humans, we rehabilitate wildlife to return to the wild." Eliot answered in silence. He knew that every night Buddy and Luna slept peacefully in the same corner, safe, protected, loved, but deep inside him, the promise kept rising: he would not let this little girl depend on him forever. The thought of eventually releasing Luna filled him with a dread so profound it sometimes made him physically ill. But he also recognized it as necessary, as the only ethical choice, as the only way to truly honor both Luna's nature and Sarah's legacy. Every tiny paw print pressed into his palm during feeding, every cry breaking through the night, every faint breath fighting the desert heat, all were proof of one simple truth. Nature may be harsh, but it can still be saved by the right kind of love, a love vast enough to know when to let go. Ahead lay months of challenges. Luna would grow, test her hunting instincts, learn again the ways of the wild. For Buddy, the loyal friend who had already lost one human companion he loved, and for Eliot, the adoptive father carrying 3 years of accumulated grief. It would be a journey filled with both hope and fear, but whenever Eliot looked at his daughter's photograph, and then at Luna sleeping soundly beside him, he understood some lives must be saved, not only so they may live, but so they may love, be free and heal the hearts that have once been broken. Time passed as swiftly as a bird's shadow sweeping across the red cliffs. Luna had grown now, her body slender yet strong, her eyes sharp as a blade, her movements carrying the fluid grace of a true hunter. At 6 months old, she stood nearly 2 feet at the shoulder, her legs already showing the distinctive length and musculature that would one day power her incredible speed. Her coat had fully developed into the classic cheetah pattern, a base of golden tan overlaid with solid black spots, with the characteristic tear marks running from the inner corners of her eyes down to the sides of her mouth. Whenever she stepped out into the clearing in front of the cabin, she was no longer timid as before, but walked with light, deliberate strides, her head held high, her tail moving with subtle adjustments that spoke of growing confidence and awareness. Yet in her eyes, Eliot still saw something unresolved, a tension between two worlds. Luna still returned to the cabin every night, still nudged her head against his hand whenever he sat writing in his journal, still made those soft chirping sounds, each with a subtly different tone, a language Eliot had learned to understand. One only the two of them shared. He had partial hearing loss from the war, damage sustained during his service in Vietnam when he had been stationed too close to artillery fire, which made him extremely attuned to body language and faint sounds, and because of that, he could hear Luna's heart more clearly than anyone else. Where others heard only random animal vocalizations, Eliot distinguished between her greeting chirp, her contentment purr, her distress call, her playful invitation. It was a vocabulary built on attention and love, and it reminded him painfully of the way he had once been able to read Sarah's moods from the smallest changes in her voice. One day, Ranger, the first wild male cheetah Luna had ever encountered, appeared near the monitoring area. The center had been tracking this particular male for over 18 months, part of their ongoing study of cheetah populations in the region. Ranger was a magnificent specimen in his prime, perhaps 4 years old, with a scarred face that testified to territorial battles and a lean, muscular build that spoke of successful hunting. His territory apparently overlapped with the soft release site they had been preparing for Luna, and his presence represented both an opportunity and a risk. At first, there were only large paw prints circling the fence, distinctive marks that Martin identified immediately during one of his monitoring visits. Then came reports of a flickering shadow between the branches, always visible just at dawn or dusk, when the two of them saw each other for the first time through the barrier. Luna froze. Her reaction was instantaneous and profound. Every muscle in her body tensed, her ears snapped forward, her pupils dilated. For a long moment, she and Ranger simply stared at each other through the chain-link fence. And Eliot, watching from the cabin porch, felt as though he were witnessing something sacred, some primal recognition passing between them. After that encounter, Luna gradually became quiet, withdrawn. She left her meals unfinished, her appetite disappearing despite Eliot's attempts to tempt her with her favorite foods. She no longer chased after Buddy or leaped onto the stone platforms like she used to, her playful energy replaced by a restless pacing along the fence line nearest to where Ranger's scent was strongest. Eliot realized this wasn't illness, it was an instinctual crisis. Luna was being torn between the human world filled with love and safety and the wild call pulsing through her blood. Her body was maturing, responding to biological imperatives that transcended all the bonds of affection she had formed with Eliot and Buddy. Martin confirmed what Eliot already suspected: Luna was entering sexual maturity. And Ranger's presence had triggered something fundamental in her, something that no amount of human love could satisfy or replace. Eliot knew he needed to let Luna go, but telling others was far easier than telling his own heart. Many nights he lay awake, flipping through the journal pages, rereading every trace of Luna's early days, every small milestone, the day she opened her eyes, her first taste of meat, the first time she climbed onto his shoulder to sleep, the first short chirp like a shy apology. Every page was a slice of vivid memory, and Eliot feared that once he let her go, he might forget it all. His memory had already begun to blur, small blank spots appearing in his recollection of recent events, names escaping him, sequences of events becoming confused. The doctor had mentioned something about normal age-related cognitive decline during his last checkup, but Eliot suspected it might be more than that, perhaps early-stage dementia. He started writing more carefully, more clearly, documenting not just Luna's progress but his own thoughts and feelings. afraid that one day he himself might forget who Luna was, might lose this precious thread connecting him to redemption and healing. At last, he made the decision. One morning, as sunlight stretched across the fence, turning the desert gold and amber, Eliot opened the gate to the enclosure in the woods. This was the soft release area Martin had helped him prepare, a larger space where Luna could come and go as she chose, gradually acclimating to independence. Luna looked at him, head tilted slightly, ears twitching with uncertainty as if asking, "Are you sure? Do you really mean this?" Eliot knelt down, his knees protesting the movement, and gently rang the small silver bell he once used to call her as a cub, the bell that had signaled feeding time and comfort and safety. Its sound hung in the air, not like a command, but like music from the heart, a benediction and a farewell combined. Luna stepped slowly toward him, each movement deliberate, and brushed her head against his hand one final time. Her rough tongue licked his palm, and he felt tears streaming down his weathered cheeks, making no effort to hide them. Then she looked toward the forest, her amber eyes focusing on something he couldn't see, some possibility that called to her from beyond the boundaries of their shared world. She looked back once more, meeting his gaze directly, and Eliot whispered, "Go, sweet child. Go be what you were meant to be." After a very small chirp, a sound that seemed to carry both gratitude and goodbye, she turned away. Eliot watched her walk into the trees, her spotted coat dappling and disappearing among the shadows and light, becoming part of the landscape in a way that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Buddy sat beside him, whining softly, and together they bore witness to this necessary departure, this painful gift of freedom. They stayed there until long after Luna had vanished from sight, until the sun climbed high enough to burn off the morning coolness and fill the canyon with heat. A few months later, Eliot heard news that Luna had been seen with Ranger, then had vanished into the deep forest. The monitoring team had captured images of them together on camera traps, moving with the synchronized grace of a bonded pair. Their bodies were often touching, sides brushing as they walked, and in one image, Luna's head was resting on Ranger's shoulder in what looked remarkably like affection. No more GPS signal after that. The collar had either malfunctioned or been damaged, which wasn't uncommon. Luna had disappeared into the wild completely, leaving behind only occasional tracks in the memory of what she had been. Eliot lowered his head onto the table, placing his hand on the old cloth Luna used to chew on when teething, a ragged piece of blanket now precious beyond measure. He wrote a letter as he had done for many days now. "Dear Luna, you know, I never imagined I would miss a sound so much. Your little chirps, the way you used to greet me every morning, the satisfied purr you made after eating these sounds filled my life with music I didn't know I needed. The cabin is so quiet now. Buddy misses you too. He still goes to your enclosure sometimes, sniffing around as if expecting you to appear. I hope you're happy. I hope Ranger treats you well. I hope you remember that you are loved." The letter was folded and placed into the blue tin box, the mailbox he kept for his Cheetah daughter, a ritual that helped him process his grief and maintain his connection to her. Then spring arrived. One early morning, before the sun had fully cleared the canyon rim, Buddy whimpered faintly at the door. It was a specific sound, different from his usual request to go outside, a sound that made Eliot's heart skip with sudden hope. He opened the door, and the sight before him made his breath catch, made his old heart pound with joy, so intense it was almost painful. On the distant rock ledge, perhaps 50 yards away, stood Luna, her body strong and healthy, her eyes bright and clear, her coat gleaming with vitality. Beside her were three small creatures, cheetah cubs wobbling on uncertain legs, but filled with curiosity, their oversized paws and spotted coats making them look like miniature copies of their mother. Eliot did not move closer, did not call out, understanding instinctively that this moment required distance and respect. He simply stood on his porch, one hand gripping the railing for support, his vision blurred by tears he made no effort to hide. Luna did not approach either, maintaining the distance appropriate to a wild cheetah protecting her young, but her gaze never left him. One of the cubs, bolder than its siblings, trotted toward Buddy, gently licking the old dog's nose in a gesture of innocent friendliness. Buddy didn't bark, didn't move. Suddenly he only breathed in softly, taking in the cub's scent. then bowed his head in what looked remarkably like recognition or blessing. Eliot sank down to the ground, his legs no longer able to support him, opened the tin mailbox with trembling hands, took out a random letter and read it aloud. His voice trembled, cracking with emotion, but his eyes shone with a mixture of joy and pride and bittersweet satisfaction that transcended words. The three cubs curled up nearby, drawn by the sound of his voice, while Buddy sat among them like a benevolent grandfather, his calm presence reassuring to these wild babies who had never encountered a dog before. Luna lay farther away, on the sun-warmed rock, her body relaxed but alert, and her eyes never drifted from Eliot. They stayed like that until the sun rose high, a tableau of interspecies connection and mutual respect, until finally Luna stood and called her cubs with a series of chirps, and they followed her back into the forest, disappearing like dreams into the wilderness. After that day, Luna left again with her cubs, but every year, on the exact day Eliot rescued her from the crevice long ago, Luna would return always on the same rock, at the same hour, as if some internal calendar kept perfect track of this anniversary. No one told her to come, no one called for her, but she always came back. Sometimes she brought her growing cubs, teaching them perhaps about the strange human who had given their mother life, allowing them to approach cautiously, to learn that not all humans were threats. Other years she came alone, her presence a silent acknowledgement of a debt that needed no words, a bond that transcended the boundaries between wild and tame, between human and animal. One year, on Eliot's 80th birthday, the center held a small gathering at his cabin. Martin was there, along with Maria, Carlos, Jennifer, and several other staff members and volunteers who had worked with Luna over the years. While everyone was laughing and talking, sharing stories and eating cake, from afar, the sound of a silver bell, the very one Eliot kept in his pocket as a talisman, suddenly rang out. The sound cut through the conversation, clear and unmistakable, and everyone fell silent, except Eliot hadn't rung the bell. It was still in his pocket, his hand resting over it protectively. The sound came from the forest, from the direction of the old tree where Eliot had hung a duplicate bell years ago, hoping Luna might one day learn to ring it herself. Eliot stood up slowly, his 80-year-old body moving with deliberate care, his eyes turning toward the forest. No particular figure emerged from the shadows, but fresh tracks would later be found near the tree, and the bell would be still swinging when they checked. Eliot smiled, an expression of pure joy spreading across his weathered face, and whispered, "You're here. I know." Everyone at the party understood that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that challenged their assumptions about animal consciousness and memory and the possibility of love between species. No one said anything more, but everyone fell silent because some signals need no proof, and some loves need no words. Luna's story was recorded by an intern and turned into a documentary. It spread widely through wildlife conservation circles and beyond, eventually being picked up by a major streaming service, helping the center receive funding to continue operating and expand its programs. The film captured not just the rescue and release, but the deeper narrative of healing and redemption, of how saving one life can transform another, of how grief can be transmuted into purpose. Eliot never knew the full extent of the impact. He simply lived peacefully in his small cabin, still writing in his journal, still letting Buddy lie by his feet, and still lighting a small lamp each night. He gave one brief interview for the documentary, speaking haltingly about his daughter, about their unresolved arguments, about how Luna had taught him what he had been too stubborn to learn before Sarah's death, that love sometimes means letting go, that wild things deserve freedom, that redemption is possible even for broken hearts. Many years later, when Eliot had passed on peacefully in his sleep at the age of 84, people found the tin mailbox and the journals he left behind. His death had been gentle, with Buddy curled at the foot of his bed, and when they discovered him in the morning, there was a smile on his face, as if he had seen something beautiful in his final dreams. Inside the lid of the tin box was a single sentence, written in Eliot's careful script: "Thank you, Luna. Because of you, I learned again how to love and forgive myself." Near the cabin, on the trunk of the old cottonwood tree where the bell still hung, They placed a small stone plaque, Eliot Walker, a man who once fathered a star. The words had been Martin's suggestion, inspired by something Eliot had written in his final journal entry, about how Luna had shone in his darkness like a celestial guide, leading him back to himself, back to his daughter's memory, back to life. Every autumn, fresh cheetah tracks reappeared nearby, as if some part of Luna's lineage remembered, as if the bond between a broken man and an orphaned cheetah had somehow transcended death itself and lived on in the generations that followed. The center staff took to calling them Luna's legacy, and they continued Eliot's work, protecting this land where one man's redemption had unfolded paw print by paw print, tear by tear, feeding by feeding, until healing finally came. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the desert held its breath between darkness and light, some swore they could still hear it, the soft chirp of a cheetah, the answering whine of a tongue, and the gentle voice of an old man whispering, "Sweet child, you're home." Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.